involved in some way, in some fashion. At some point, for example, sugar production statistics were not released because Fidel Castro said that those were very important. They didn't want the enemy to know how much sugar Cuba was producing. It's a strange way of looking at the world, but that's a way of a totalitarian mentality. The embargo. Let me say, what is the most asked question about the embargo? Anybody can help me with that?
When will it end?
When will it end? Okay. Another question on the embargo.
I often hear that they say, well, why don't they just get rid of the trade embargo? Why aren't Americans allowed just to do business in Cuba? And I wonder if they know that the Americans are doing business.
Okay. Just one final question before I tell you my side of the story. Yes.
Isn't an embargo just a label that really doesn't exist?
Okay. The most important question, the most often asked question that I usually get is, are you for or against embargo? And the answer to that is twofold. I am for. I'm also against embargo. And people would ask, why is that? I say, well, if the embargo is lifted, so the embargo meaning all the restrictions, the economic restrictions the United States has on trade with Cuba, on loans to Cuba, on Cuban access to the World Bank and so on. If those sanctions are lifted so that in order to obtain a number of things, for example, the release of all Cuban political prisoners, well, I would be in favor of lifting, or at least to begin the process to lift the embargo. If the embargo is lifted so that Cubans in Cuba have the same rights and same opportunities that foreigners have in Cuba. For example, if a foreigner can go to Cuba and invest in a little shop, if a Cuban in Cuba could get some money from their relatives abroad, like the Mexicans do or the Salvadorians, and start a little business, I would be in favor of that. If the Cubans were to be allowed into Varadero and other areas where Cubans are not allowed in their own country, if Cubans were permitted to move. If you live in Santiago de Cuba and you want to move to Havana, why should you need a special permit by the police in order to live there? Well, I don't, and you see, this is sort of civil society measures. With the exception of the release of political prisoners, I'm not really talking about free elections under international supervision. I'm not talking about a free and independent press. I'm not talking about many of the political issues. If those things that I mentioned could happen, I would be in favor of beginning the process of lifting of the embargo. And I think many folks outside Cuba will be in favor of that. So the question is not whether the embargo should be lifted, but how, for what purpose, in what time frame. Now, if you tell me the embargo will be lifted so that Cubans will continue to get paid $20 a month, and foreign companies could be able to continue to go to Cuba and profit from the misery of the Cuban people. If the embargo is lifted so that the Cuban military will continue to control the tourist industry. The military in Cuba control all the hotels, all the anything having to do with tourism. So that the tourist dollar doesn't really go to a Cuban that wants to have a little business and produce something for the hotel industry. A Cuban that wants to grow vegetables and sell them to a hotel directly, he cannot do that. Everything is controlled by the government. So if the embargo is lifted to consolidate, to strengthen the current system, of course, I am against that kind of lifting of the sanctions. And I don't think that's really far-fetched. Even as we meet here tonight, there's a lot of discussion in Washington about sanctions. The case of Burma, for example, when the British and the American diplomats went to Burma, met with the lady who was elected president of Burma. She's on the house arrest. And she was told, how do you feel about lifting the sanctions against the military regime in your country? And she said, in exchange for what? That's the question. In exchange for what? If the idea is to lift the sanctions on the regime's terms, in other words, whatever they want, the U.S. should give it to them, and the Cuban government would not give anything in return, then I think the question is very important. In exchange for what? The other issue about embargo is the embargo is not what it used to be. People talk about embargo, and one of you asked that question. People talk about embargo as if the world has not changed. The embargo that was put in place in the early 1960s due to the confiscation of American properties without payment to American owners is no longer what we have. For many years now, American companies can sell food and medicine to Cuba. And they sell hundreds of millions of food and medicine to Cuba. Let me explain that for many years the Cuban government claimed that Cuban children were dying because of lack of American medicine. That's one of the great propaganda lies of the Cuban government. Cuba, of course, could buy American medicine in Canada, in Mexico, everywhere. Now that the U.S. Congress has decided years ago to allow the sale of medicine to Cuba, Havana doesn't want to buy American medicine. Anybody knows why? No? Huh?
Too expensive?
It's too expensive. It's exactly right. There's a big discussion in the U.S. Congress right now about allowing what they call the re-importation of American medicine from Canada. It just happened that because of various international price adjustments, you could buy American medicine at a cheaper price outside the United States than inside the United States. So all the propaganda campaign about Cuban children dying was simply propaganda, was simply lies. And lies that were repeated sometimes by well-meaning people that felt, oh my God, Cuban children are dying because of American policy. That wasn't the case. Beyond that, why should American taxpayers subsidize the Cuban government? The Cuban government is bankrupt. Cuba owes the Paris Club. This is a consortium of banks in Paris. Banks that are governments and banks. Cuba owes billions of dollars and stopped paying principal and interest to the Paris Club in 1986, before the collapse of the Soviet Union. So Cuba received for many, many years the kind of assistance and international support and development aid that some countries receive under the Marshall Plan. At the end of World War II, the United States decided that we're going to give money, assistance to the European nations that have been destroyed by a war. And Cuba has received more money than some of those nations received under the Marshall Plan. And that's one of the reasons why we do not believe that opening up financial sources to Cuba is going to make any difference. Because the money that has been sent to the Cuban government by other governments, by other banks, by international organizations has gone into this black hole of inefficiency, propaganda, and so on of the Cuban government.